Welcome to Corner Case. You're in the hobby corner. It's not only me today. We have another best friend on the channel. We have.
Basheer goes. Pleasure to meet you all.
Thank you, Basheer. And today we will be discussing Haqqislam from Infinity the Game. Roll the intro. Welcome back. We're here to talk about Haqqislam, a faction from Infinity the Game. We're here with Basheer, an expert. Basheer, please tell us who you are, what do you do?
Hello, I'm Basheer Gauss. I am a freelance writer, game designer, and cultural consultant in the tabletop RPG industry. I've worked with a bunch of companies like Paizo, Kobold Press, and Rowan Rook and Deckard and Critical Role on stuff like the Tal'Dorei campaign Reborn, the Tome of Beasts 3 from Kobold Press, and a bunch of other stuff kind of throughout the industry. I've also written an article on Haqqislam on my site, Fear the Swarth, which isn't updated very often anymore, but I'll periodically write stuff up on, as well as some of my own games.
So you really sound like you know what you're talking about, just given your background in game design, and just playing games in general, and also, you know, being of the background that you are. Sounds like you're really like in a position to be an expert in this. So I'm really excited to get into what we're talking about. So for our audience, like, how did you find out about Infinity, and was it your first miniatures game?
So I found out about Infinity from, at the time I was just playing the X-Wing miniatures game. I wanted to get into a traditional skirmish war game again, because I hadn't played one for almost a decade at that point. And I was kind of looking through what was available, and I found there's this one skirmish war game with a Muslim army, and it doesn't look like egregiously terrible. And so I looked into it, and I found not only was it not terrible, I really liked Haqqislam as a faction. And that was the entire reason I got into Infinity. Like, I now love it as a system and how it's structured as a game, but at the time it was purely on, there's a Muslim faction in this, the characters aren't terrible, it doesn't seem egregiously racist. I am on board. I'm going to spend several $100s and hours of my time getting into this game.
Wow. That's really awesome.
Yeah, it wasn't my first war game. I think I technically started, so Dungeons and Dragons used to have a miniatures war game way back in 3.5.
Oh, wow.
And I technically started on that when I was like 11 or 12, because we'd got the miniatures when getting miniatures for playing D&D at home, and we now also had the rules for this miniature war game, so we tried playing that, me and my brother and a couple of our friends. And then I tried Warhammer when I was a teenager. That ended up being too expensive for a teenager, and I drifted out of it. And then like X-Wing in my 20s, and then Infinity, which I now and still play.
That's really great.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine there are probably more people out there like you who found some faction in Infinity, because the setting is kind of like just a future, but future international. So there's a lot of countries and cultures represented. Imagine it's a good gateway.
Like most, if not all, of the Muslim people I've met while wargaming were playing Infinity at the time. I know that it has a significant following in like the Philippines and Malaysia, because Pano-Shiano, one of the factions, is nominally Philippine and Malaysian. And you hear stories like that with some regularity, just kind of following Infinity communities, which is one of the things I really like about the game, is that it makes this effort to be international, and even when it's flawed, it's good. It's the people it's talking about often like it, or often see themselves in it enough to draw those people into the game, which is really nice to see, because you just don't get that elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a unique thing. Yeah, because the other systems I've seen are, you know, maybe fantasy settings where, you know, the real world representation doesn't necessarily apply. You know, sometimes they will throw things in. Like, I feel like almost every game has some version of like this is the Japanese faction.
Yep.
But besides that, like, you're usually in some fantasy setting where like I'm an elf or I'm a dwarf or something, and it's just completely removed. So that grounded connection, I think, is kind of what you're talking about. That's really important.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's definitely a case. Even in fantasy settings, if you had like an Araby or like an Arabian or an Indian-inspired faction, in the way that humans often kind of default to like Renaissance Italy or medieval France or England, that would definitely be a draw for a bunch of people. I think I would certainly be more interested in a fantasy war game if it had those. And occasionally you'll kind of get the coding of a place, of a people or culture, but applied to a fantasy species. Like this has kind of been a perennial problem with orcs, is that they often just code as native people or African American or African people or whoever, like, or the Far East or whatever as like a negative stereotype, which has been kind of a prevalent thing in tabletop games more than wargaming. Wargaming takes a lot more from 40k, like Warhammer Fantasy and 40k's approach to them to a degree, which is less of an issue on that front.
Dude, I'm learning a crazy amount right now. Like, first of all, you said the word coding. So just for myself, my ignorance, and for anyone at home who may be unfamiliar, exactly what do you mean by that? I'm getting the context clues, but I just want to be
yeah.
clear.
So coding is when you have something in a fictional setting or something in a real life context which is supposed to represent another thing without actively being it. So you'll have a set in a fantasy setting. For European coding, for example, you have your standard humans in a fantasy setting are generally European coded. They have these big chunky knights in plate armor. They are generally white. They speak something close to English or have like English or German derived names. And so even though it's not literally England, it's coded as England, or it's coded as France or Germany or Italy.
Okay. Wow. That's okay. That's a good word to use. I'll be using that in the future. Thank you. I think while we're on the topic of some vocabulary here, I guess as we continue to talk about Haqqislam here, you know, just what vocabulary will we need to discuss it?
So a few of the basic ones are Orientalism, codified by Edward Said in his book called Orientalism, is an analysis of the way works in the West frame the East, especially the Muslim world in Edward Said's work. But to some degree, like anywhere in Asia and to a degree Africa, and especially North Africa and the Middle East or Southwest Asia, depending on the terminology you're using, specifically with how these places are codified or are represented as being some combination of decadent and ancient and mystical in ways that the West isn't, or as a specific contrast to it. It would be useful to know the Quran and Hadith and Sunnah, because those are things that'll come up with some specific bits of Haqqislam's writing. The Quran is obviously the holy book of Islam. The Hadith are sayings of the Prophet Muhammad or stories of the Prophet Muhammad transmitted down through the ages, and the Sunnah are collections of the actions of the Prophet Muhammad, so things that he did often, that were again recorded and kind of passed down through history.
Okay, and clarifying question. Just wanted to stop right here really quick and just clarify. So just to run back to Orientalism, I think just as we're having these discussions, I know that sometimes the discussions may be sensitive, so I just want to make sure that I think if I'm understanding correctly, Orientalism should be a neutral term. It just happens to describe how Eastern cultures, those being predominantly what you said, from Asian countries or in some cases Africa, are the perception of those from the point of view of Western cultures or countries, which is predominantly Europe, I think it sounds like. So it's just one point of view of another place from another place. I don't think that's it's a neutral term, I think.
Yeah, in practice, it will often end up being used negatively, because when things are pointed out, it's generally when something's wrong.
Yeah.
But it's in theory not universally negative. In practice, it often ends up being, just because of when it gets brought up.
Yeah, the context of when that actually happens. Yeah. What about some specific characters? The only one that I know off the top of my head, I think, is Saladin, I think is how you say it. He's like in O12, but he's also in Hawk.
A pretty neat character who has some like specific stuff going on in Infinity with Haqqislam and like the recreations. But the one I'd like to talk about is Rahman Rouhani, who is Huck's character in Defiance, who I believe it was either in his original like data card for Defiance or in a fan edit of it, has his ethnicity listed as NASA, because he
What?
because his family are like Muslim Americans who came to Barack with like the first wave of colonists
Wow.
from America, which is really cool to see as a Muslim American because we don't get positive representation in pretty much anything. And
Wow. That's
yeah.
amazing.
And functionally the most usable doctor in the game character in the game right now is a Muslim American dude whose family used to work at NASA before the U.S. collapsed in Infinity and Barack was founded, which is a really nice thing to see. He's a pretty recent character, and it's nice to have him like spotlit in the big character game that is Defiance.
Wow. That's so like now that you describe that, one thing that I think is so cool about that is that one character seems to encapsulate like a lot of the things we already talked about where it's multinational, so he's American, but he's actually like from NASA pretty much, and he happens to be Muslim, and so it seems like it's kind of globalist. I think it's kind of cool. Yeah, that's and they do that with just like a couple bits of information.
Yeah, just like a handful of character bio bits that came out with Defiance, and you've kind of got this entire story laid out for you because that story of immigrants to America and working in the sciences and kind of moving from there and is one that's common to a lot of people in the U.S. Even if you're not Muslim, like the immigrant story and identifying with the place that you've been raised in for a few generations is nice to see, and it's something that we don't see often in other war games.
Wow, that actually, dude, you just blew my mind, man. Like just relating it back to the American dream immigrant experience, on top of it just being like this super at least relatable for you and other people in your similar situation with such a small amount of information, just character bios, and then on top of that relating it back to the immigrant experience kind of makes it relatable to a huge group of people. That's so many people. And then when I think about in the context of I've heard of older Infinity, some people have called it a little bit of like a cover band in terms of just like tossing in like as many references as they can. So I think it's kind of fun to think that they're kind of evolving past that cover band kind of status with their lore into actually being really savvy about creating these small moments for us.
Yeah, it's really nice to see. The other character that I really like out of Haqqislam is Tariq Mansouri, who is kind of the iconic or was the iconic Huck character for a while, just kind of this giant quaddage, basically Haqqislam's Captain America, who is just a lot of fun, especially in N3 when he had debatably broken rules in the original Fatality rules, but also like Muslim Captain America is in and of itself a concept that we don't get often. It ties into Huck's medical science thing, and it ties into Infinity's cool twist on Huck's medical science and like the part of its heritage in that the super soldiers, basically successful super soldier projects are a big part of Haqqislam's lore, especially for some of the sectorials, which is one of the bits that I really liked about it. There isn't much to I don't really have any I guess the Nazgarova sisters were a little who are kind of the biker twin sisters in Haqqislam's lore, were like a little bit of a stereotype regarding kind of their stick was being basically exotic femme fatales, like sleeping their way to the top of this biker gang, or like working their way to the top of this biker gang and murdering the men above them and stuff like that, which is just a stereotype I'm not super fond of. It plays into some of the nastier stuff around in Orientalism regarding like the portrayal of women and the misogyny in Eastern societies that's largely ignored in other factions. It isn't really a thing there, but it kind of just is here and in Druze to some extent. They've changed it a little bit with N4. There's a bit of improvement there in that like they're kind of at the top now, and so the nature of their story has changed. But it's still like there is kind of a bit of a sour note. It's one of the few things I don't like about Huck, even though both characters are like they're great units in the game, but the story around them plays into some stereotypes around the Muslim world that I'm not thrilled about being in the game. But like, by and large, Hawk has great characters.
Yeah, I think that's really important to note. Is I know that there are probably a lot of misconceptions, and so I think this sounds like it's maybe pushing one that isn't probably it's not a healthy one to be pushing.
Yeah.
That's too bad, because the models do look pretty cool. I don't mind a little cheese in my models, but or I guess they call it cake. I don't mind a little cake in my models, but I do know that that's not always the best thing. And Infinity has received criticism for it. And I must admit, it does, while we're pushing the, trying to be better at representation, then, the cake becomes a little bit less appropriate, especially if it's only like one-sided. So yeah, I think there's probably a couple things going on with those Nazgarova twins.
Yeah.
Which I guess we could talk even more about, like positive improvements. I think so far we've been like pretty happy. Sounds like your overall outlook on the faction, you're really happy to be in it. What other things that us as non-Muslim people may not see about it that you think may be done better?
So the big one is actually, it's basically a throwaway bit of lore. It isn't important to anything, but it kind of shows up whenever the faction is described in books and lore books and the like. Namely, the neo-rationalist way, the neo-rationalist Islam that it portrays. Some of the details of it are kind of, they've thrown out the Quran and Sunnah, or like they ignore the Quran and Sunnah, or the Sunnah and Hadith. They only use the Quran, and it's based on this old actual Islamic rationalist movement from the 600s, 700s-ish that is pretty popular, especially among like reformist groups, but it's a kind of monolithic view of a reformed Islam that I think it simplifies the problems in the Muslim world and in the Middle East in ways that play into old stereotypes, where it's kind of the idea, the problem is all these old traditions, and if you throw those out, you get a much better, purer thing. And it ignores a lot of the smaller, like a lot of the diversity of religious opinion that makes Islam what it is. And that's a thing that's often ignored in practice in like other lore. So whenever you get kind of what's Haqqislam's religious structure like, it's generally something that would be reasonably familiar to most Muslims, but the Hadith and the Sunnah are an incredibly important part of how most Muslims practice. So how you pray isn't something that's detailed in the Quran. The Quran doesn't seem to care that, like, doesn't mention it, the specifics of this is how prayer works. Those are things that are passed down in the Hadith and Sunnah. And so if you go, these things are no longer referenced, you're saying that all of these enormous parts of Muslim life aren't referenced, even if that's clearly what's not meant by the text. It isn't a great thing to do. There are groups that do parts of what Haqqislam has, like there are actual movements that it's taking from, but it's kind of ignored everyone else and all the other reformist groups who don't do that in the process, which isn't great. So, for example, the Assassins are a Haqq faction based obviously on the old Assassins in real life, in history, and to a degree, like popular portrayals of them in media. And the Assassins were originally basically a religious group who felt that they were persecuted, and a lot of their fighting was based around they wanted religious freedom, and they wanted to they wanted to either strike back or have a safe place from the issues that they saw in the rest of the world. And that was a core part, like being different from everyone else and being Shia rather than Sunni was a core part of what made them them. And it's something that in practice is basically there in the Hassas and Bahram, but it's something that doesn't make sense under the, Quran. It's less that it doesn't make sense, it's more that it isn't there explicitly in Infinity's write-up. It's something that you would entirely miss because it seems like it's not the portrayal Infinity has of Haqqislam as a theological movement is one that doesn't have the room for something like that inside of it. Even though, in practice, in the setting, it clearly does. Like, the assassins are there again. They're clearly based off of the old assassins. They are often fighting for the same things the old assassins fought for, or at least things descended from those, like, lines of thought.
Interesting. I think one thing you mentioned there that I just want to walk it back a little bit that I thought was kind of an interesting thing that you said was, I think you said the diversity of religious opinion. I think that's not something I've really heard much. So personally, you know, as a Filipino person, I was high probability of being raised Catholic, and I was. And a lot of people around me are Christian, but I don't ever really see those lines crossing. You know, usually you pick your denomination or something, and that's usually like what you're on. And I think diversity of religious opinion doesn't really, at least in my experience in my life, hasn't really played a part. But it sounds like, from what you're describing, it's a part of Islam and is embraced to some degree. Can you?
So like all forms of Islam have a bunch of different. So there isn't a singular authority in Islam. Like there isn't a pope to go back to, or like centralized clergy to resolve religious disputes. So so much of it is based on kind of how people practice and the religious authorities they go to and their opinions, and these opinions obviously diverge massively because they're different people looking at the same thing and coming to different conclusions from it. And so you have things like in Sunni Islam, which I follow, there are a bunch of schools of thought, and there are some major ones, but there are also many more minor ones. And in those major ones, you have these enormous diversities of opinion, and the debates of religious scholars were an important thing, and it still are an important thing in Islam in how the religion is practiced and interpreted through this day. Shia often have a similar thing going with different religious thoughts, schools of religious thought and ways that they practice or believe that make up every Muslim country on the planet, every Muslim majority country on the planet. Every masjid in the US pretty much is going to have an enormous variety of schools of thought and ways people practice their religion in it, which has been kind of a part of that history forever. And it would be nice to just like tweak a few of those opening lines to make it more clear what's up with that. There's some like historical trivia with the specific schools they drew from to make Haqqislam that's kind of interesting, but isn't really. It's less cogent criticism than it is like, here's an interesting historical fact. The original rationalists that like they named Haqqislam after, there isn't actually much in common between Haqq and them, were kind of huge assholes. Like they took over a kingdom for a bit and were kind of huge pricks to everyone else, and then immediately got kicked out in the aftermath of it because they were huge pricks to everyone else.
Wait, so you're saying, hold on, you're saying that Haqqislam, they took the name from this group of people?
They took the name of the philosophy it's based on. So like the original rationalist Islam thing, which was Mu'tazila.
Interesting.
Like Haqqislam is described in some of the books as Neo-Mu'tazila, and there are actual groups right now who describe themselves as Neo-Mu'tazila because they see it as like a more rational and purer form of Islam, and the actual original non-Neo-Mu'tazila were kind of just giant pricks.
It kind of makes you wonder if that's kind of like a thing where that word in English is just really marketable, and maybe they thought that they might have been trying to put a more positive light on Islam by using that word specifically.
I think that they were. I think like it's harmless outside of historical trivia. In practice.
Wow.
And there are actual groups that like use it for their attempts to like navigate Islam in the modern day. But it's one with historical baggage that most people don't realize it has, because a lot of the people who latch onto it, or a lot of like the external people who latch onto it, who say like, you know, as an objective observer from the West that you'll occasionally get in like think pieces, they think that actually Muslims should go back to these guys who I've read about, who they were rationalists, and that means they would have worked out, and we approve of them, and then don't look too closely at it and realize, oh no, that that is a very different definition of rationalism than any of us would use.
That's the power of marketing, man.
Yeah.
If anything, sounds like that group real good at marketing.
Yeah, about like 1,300 years late to help them, but yeah.
The name stuck, man.
Yep.
I wonder if people remember the name Coca-Cola in 1,300 years, man. But tell you, they'll remember the rationalists.
And then, in terms of other stuff that could use some improvement, there are the odalisques, who I think Corvus Belli has kind of recognized that they're an issue. So in the game, they're kind of the sexy female bodyguard model for a Hawk, which most factions had one of at the height of CB's let's put some cheesecake in the game phase. Specifically, the odalisques aren't based on a historical Muslim thing, or they are based on a historical Orientalist European misunderstanding of a historical Muslim thing.
Okay.
Namely, odalisque basically means washerwoman. They were the people you would hire, like they were the women you would hire to wash clothes.
Oh, really?
If you were in the Ottoman Empire in the certain time period. But they were like they were working in like kind of the women's quarters of the house.
Okay.
And because European, like rich male European visitors weren't allowed into the portion of the house, they exoticized this, and so you have a bunch of paintings called like, you know, portrayal of an odalisque or whatever that are basically just a naked white woman in an Ottoman inspired architecture, which a lot of Orientalist painting specifically is an excuse to paint naked white women that happen to be in a Eastern situation and therefore not something you can get yelled at for by your wife.
Oh man, expectation, naked white woman, and an Oriental kind of flavor.
Yeah, and reality, just someone very confused staring at you while they're washing clothes. And so odalisques are kind of taken from this.
What?
Are taken from this artistic misunderstanding, let's say, and play heavily into it, and are like, yeah, they're the cybernetically enhanced, like, sexy female bodyguards. The RPG is kind of tweaked at it by going, they are gender inclusive sexy bodyguards, and so they're male or female, and that's an improvement, but it's still kind of, it is very specifically playing on these negative tropes of the East as this sexual exotic place where women are being exploited, and then and in defiance of what was actually going on there, and like maybe it's in-universe marketing or whatever, but as the writer you chose to make this a thing, and it's unfortunate. It is a hilarious story to tell people about, though.
Yeah, I've never even heard of anything like that before. That's quite the misunderstanding.
Yeah. So a lot of harem tropes basically come from the locals weren't letting these rich dudes into their wives' part of the house, and so there's a lot of it is just like exoticized imaginings of what must be going on back there.
Man. But they know what they're doing, because they even have that model that's called like the Dragon Lady, and Dragon Lady is actually just like a trope.
Yeah.
That's actually just the name of a trope. That would be like if they named the model Forever Foreigner.
Yep. Yeah, that's and so they know what they're doing on their front. They've done it in other factions. They've done it to Ariadna in like a couple of units.
Is this the noble savage model, or
I don't remember which one, but like there are a couple of I think just line infantry models that were very aggressively, this is just a cheesecake model.
Oh, boy.
It's just that with the odalisque, this also has, and with the Dragon Lady, this also has the negative side effect of playing into these negative stereotypes. There isn't a great way to fix it, in that you've made this thing, and the most you can do is kind of apologize and maybe like change up the lore a bit. Like, this is a specific marketing gimmick of playing on this idea. But it's still like, even if you acknowledge you've done the Orientalist thing, you've still done the Orientalist thing.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's
And-
no way out.
Yep. But it's it's overweighed by far by the things I love about Haqqislam, specifically its super soldier programs, which are probably my favorite in fiction, because the gimmick of the Huck super soldier program,
Yeah.
besides like incredible medical science, is we have a functioning ethics program for our super soldiers.
Nice.
And therefore we have not had them go rogue and kill the staff or be unreproducible one-offs or whatever. No, we make this properly, we make sure it's safe to use, and then we implant it, and you don't have like the Halo thing of mounds of dead babies outside the testing center or whatever. No, it just works.
Oh
And,
man, Winter Soldier, not on my watch.
yeah. So like my personal favorite sectorial fluff-wise is the Ramah Taskforce, because like they're the big super soldier heroes, and that's just not a thing we get to do
Dude,
in
this
fiction.
this is make me want to play this faction now. You know, like
Hey, absolutely, pick up RTF.
yeah, cause yeah, like it's so hard to actually get like good lore videos or like lore, cause without actually like reading the books and stuff, and the content creators are very few and far between. So when they do cover a faction, it's usually like pretty surface level. So actually like going into it this deep this is selling me real hard, man. Don't be surprised if like a month from now, rolling into Game Castle with a full-blown Ramah Task Force.
Hey, that would be great to see.
I think you know, and this might be actually my own insecurity here. I'm going off script now, but you know, sometimes I see these things and I feel like I'm not like that one wasn't made for me, so I'm like not allowed to play it. I know not every gamer might feel that way, you know, but just sometimes I might feel that way about a certain faction where like, hey, that wasn't made for me. I'm not allowed to play it. But in talking to you about it, I feel like now I'm like, oh, I kind of like understand where it's like coming from now. I know why other people like it. I feel like I have permission to like it. Because when you see that, you know, especially kind of like you talked about there's not really that much positive representation of Muslim people. So when I see a faction like that on the shelves, I'm like how ignorant am I going to look if I play this? Like, I don't know if it's good. You know, I don't know if it's harmful or not, even if I think it looks cool. You know, and I didn't realize that was going unsaid until we talked just now. So that's kind of a cool moment. So good to know. I can feel safe buying it without feeling like maybe I might be pushing something that may be harmful.
I definitely get the feeling of like, this isn't made for me, am I good to play it? But I broadly encourage people to play. I think the point of making things like Huck or more diverse role-playing games for the field I'm in is for more people to experience like a positive depiction of the culture these are from. And while I get 100% get the insecurity, I genuinely encourage anyone watching this, if you thought the things I described were cool about Huck were cool, go out and buy an army. Find your local Infinity group. Make one if you have to.
Yeah, for sure. Wow, we unpacked a lot right there. And you know, you just talked about games you're working on. Tell us a little bit more. I think our audience would love to hear about kind of your process or anything you're excited about right now.
Yeah, so I'm not sure when this video is going to come out, so the Kickstarter may have ended by then, but I designed a bunch of monsters for Kobold Press's Tomb of Beasts 3, which is currently on Kickstarter. It has some miniatures of monsters that I made that you can get as add-ons for the book if you get it.
Nice.
Which is really cool. Yeah, so if that's still on Kickstarter, back it and like grab the Necrotech Thunderer miniature, because that is a monster I designed that I am extremely proud of, and that looks great on the mini. It's like an undead elephant with a magic siege weapon built onto the top half of its back.
Whoa.
It's kind of got the top half of its skull removed, so it's got a ballista bolt coming out of there. It is pretty rad. I designed a bunch of monsters that range from like kind of funny to horrifying to basically a magical nuclear submarine for that, which are all really cool. I'm working on an independent game at the moment called Ahadi, which is kind of the experience of Star Sector or Mountain Blade as a role-playing game, which is still currently in early playtesting, but hopefully it'll be coming out, or it'll be coming to crowdfunding or some platforms or some marketplaces near the end of this year. And yeah.
Wow, that's a lot of stuff, man. You sounds like we've got the Muslim super soldier right here. Sounds like you're running around a lot, getting those miles in. Then the amount of creativity you need to design all of that, and it sounds like you've been doing this for a while, man. I feel let's I want to take this chance to thank you so much because, you know, I even just feel so fortunate that like someone like you is even close by within proximity. If I was just like a couple 100 miles away or even like 50 miles away, would I have been able to have this talk with you? And I think this is like stuff that I want to see. And for the most part, I think part of that content not being online is just accessibility. There's very few people like you who have you're a game designer and you're also an expert at your culture, and you're really good at describing it, so for you to be able to come by here and us being able to talk to you, just such a blessing. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Like, all of that wouldn't mean anything if you hadn't reached out about doing this, if you hadn't invited me here and like invited me into the studio to come record this. And just thank you so much for having me. It's been great being here. It's been lovely meeting you.
And I hope you can come back soon because you mentioned elephants, and that reminded me of Lord of the Rings. So now we got to unpack that. They just kind of threw in that Oliphant right at the end, and they just like kind of let it slide. So now I'm kind of wondering that probably wasn't that good. But that's probably a talk for another time.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, so I'll link your website in the description below, and the Kickstarter, if it's still going at the time of release. We do have a packed schedule, but we'll be working on that today.
No worries.
So thank you so much. And then any of the things that you think are interesting to link, we'll put those in the description. I know spellings and all that stuff. We'll make sure that's clear for the audience at home. But thank you so much for educating us on Islam and Muslim people and how Haqqislam, the lore, is kind of built and how that makes you feel, because that's not something we would ever know unless we talked. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So with that, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much. We're always desperate for your validation, and leave comments below for Basheer, and you can reach him via his website or any other comms we place in the description. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
I am ready to subscribe again.